So I just ask that your Holy Spirit would fill this place, this room. And ultimately, God, one of the things that I feel like you've called me to is to help men walk in greater freedom, Lord, to walk in the light, and to live as sons of God who know who and whose they are, and who know how to walk in greater freedom and joy, Lord. And so I just pray that you would cover this time, cover me as I share. And again, thank you for gathering us today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Yes. So one of the things that Steve asked me to talk about specifically with this topic of sexuality is how God redeems these things. That ultimately, yes, the world, our sin, and Satan, they affect and impact sex and sexuality, but they don't own these things. They don't own these things. They don't have the full ownership of these, but these are gifts that are given by God. And He has special plans and purposes for sex and sexuality, okay? And what I want to do today is, this is kind of what I've seen happen in the world and the church and throughout history, is that the church, this is just broad scale, right? But basically that the church got spirituality and the world got sexuality, right? What I mean by that is, when you think about church, you think about God, you think about God, you think about connecting with Him, you think about spiritual matters, things like that. And then we think about sexuality, it's like, oh, that's the worldly thing, movies and entertainment and all these things. And so there's kind of like this split and this divide, right? But what we want to know is how these two interconnect, right? How these two belong together, how to steward them well, and how to glorify God through both of these topics, okay? So let's start with these two topics, spirituality and sexuality. I'm going to break it down very simply. Just to give you guys a heads up, this talk was really inspired by a book that I read sometime late last year. It's by an author named Rich Viodas, and it's called The Deeply Formed Life. So if you guys ever have a chance to read a book on that book, it's on spiritual formation, and he has a great few chapters on sex and sexuality. So I encourage you guys to look at that, because that's what a lot of this has been inspired by. Okay? So let's break these two words down. First, spirituality. Spirituality. What is spirituality? Okay? I'm going to break it down. This is how Viodas describes it too in his book. Spirituality is that deep longing inside of us. Spirituality can be described as a vast longing that drives us beyond ourselves in an attempt to connect with, to probe, to understand our world. And beyond that, it is an inner compulsion to connect with the eternal other, which is God. Very simply, right? Essentially, it's a longing to know and to be known by God. To know and to be known by God on a holistic level, emotionally, physically, psychologically, spiritually. Spirituality in a very broad and just understanding is we want to know God, right? We want to be known by God as well. Okay, so that's the definition of spirituality. What about sexuality then? What is sexuality? How does that connect with spirituality? Well, sexuality can be described as this deep desire and longing that drives us beyond ourselves in an attempt to connect with, to understand that which is other than ourselves. Okay, similar, right? But essentially, sexuality is a longing to know and to be known by other people. Okay, relationally, other people, on a physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual level. Okay, so one is primarily driven vertically, and the other is primarily driven horizontally. Okay, this is so interesting when you break it down like this, because a lot of times when people struggle with sexual sin, let's take two examples of sexual sin, pornography and masturbation, right? And when you think about topics like this, you think, what's the problem? What's the issue here? A lot of people think it's a behavioral issue. They have a problem of acting out. They have a problem of, this is an issue that is an external act that they need to just stop or cut off. But it's really interesting that when you think about it this way, in terms of sexuality and sexual sin, it's really, people say, is an intimacy disorder. It's an intimacy problem, right? That whenever people struggle with, sexual sin, there is a relational, intimate disconnect within all different spheres of a person's life. So that's just something to keep in the back of your minds. If you've ever struggled with sexual sin, right, chances are, most of the time, there's some kind of relational brokenness that goes much deeper than we're often even aware of. And one of the ways that people find breakthrough in this area is you start learning how to have healthy relationships. You start understanding what it means to be intimate in terms of making yourself known, right? And also being known by others. Okay, so that's just a broad scope here. But these are two definitions that I wanted to break down for us today when it comes to spirituality and sexuality. Spirituality connects us upward to God. Sexuality connects us outward to people. And both are God-given, and both are good. There are two different expressions of sexuality that I'd like to draw our attention to. And this is new for me too, as I was reading and learning about it too. But one of the terms is social sexuality. Social sexuality is the longing we all have to deeply bond with others and to be seen and known and to know and to see. Right? Genesis 1, right, reminds us that we're made in the image of God. Right? And one of the ways that we reflect him is through relationships. You know, just like if you think about the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, they exist in perfect fellowship. We are also made for a community, right? And there's a classic example that the author of this book that I mentioned talks about is he was taking his 5-year-old son to the playground, okay? And so he's playing in the playground, and as he was playing, he happened to make a friend that day. Okay, and he was really excited. They got along. And the next morning, the son said, "Oh, can we go to the playground again? I really want to go back." Right? And he noticed that his son was wearing the exact same outfit as yesterday. The same t-shirt, same everything. And he asked, like, why are you, wearing what you wore yesterday? And the son responded this way. He said, "Because my friend might not remember me if I wear a different shirt. He might not remember me if I wear something different that day." So he was so adamant about, I have to wear this exact same thing because that's how he saw and remembered me from yesterday. And I want to go again today wearing the same thing. Now, I think it's kind of adorable and cute, right? But what's going on here? Like, what's the deeper thing is that he's longing to make a connection. He was longing to belong and have this relationship, to be recognized, to be seen. That is social sexuality at work. You already see it at young ages and kids like that, but there's this desire to connect, right, and to have relationship. Okay, so that's social sexuality. And then the one that I think we're also familiar with is also known as genital sexuality. Now, this is not just about bodies colliding with each other, but truly, if we understand it, it's an act of self-giving, mutual indwelling love that points to something beyond ourselves. This kind of love requires the powerful and nurturing safeguard found in marriage. Now, in Genesis 2, we read that a man shall leave his father and mother and be one or united with his wife, and that the two will become one flesh. Now, here in genital sexuality, right, it takes on a covenantal form, right? So that's physical intimacy in marriage, but also two people who give themselves completely to each other, body, mind, and soul. It's an act of deep vulnerability and deep trust. Now, what happens though is that many people confuse these two or try to connect it in ways that are unhealthy, right? They think that if you want to belong, right? If you want to be seen, if you want to be connected with someone, then the only way you can do that is to express yourself through genital sexuality, right? Basically, if I don't have sex with somebody, then I'm not really known in the ways that I want to be, right? Many people think that that's the only way that you can express yourself when it comes to sexuality. But let's consider how much social sexuality affects the quality of our relationships in terms of intimacy, in terms of connecting with people, and how oftentimes there's a deeper longing for friendship and belonging, right, that exists outside of a covenant within marriage. And I think that's something I want us to keep in the back of our minds as we continue. Now, this is all good, right? God's design, right, within relationships, within, creating human beings and all that. But very early on in the Bible, all of this gets tainted, right? All of this gets broken, right? Shame enters the story. And in Genesis 3, right, Adam and Eve eat the fruit and everything changes, right? Everything changes. They suddenly realize that they're naked, right? They start covering themselves up with fig leaves. And the first time they feel shame. Okay. Before sin, right, they saw each other with pure eyes. Their bodies were not just objects, right, to consume, but they saw a whole person that was made in God's image. But after sin, the vision changes. Their eyes were opened in a less favorable way. They saw each other with distortion now. Vulnerability, right, that was meant to be beautiful, now becomes unsafe, right? And they hid not only from each other, but they hid from God as well. So when you think about all of this, guys, so far, right, the spirituality and sexuality, right, social sexuality, genital sexuality, what we see now is that there's just a lot of brokenness and there's a lot of hiding in both aspects of people's lives. All of us, because of sin, are sexually broken. Okay? All of us. It doesn't matter the extent of the struggles you've had with sin in this area before, but because it affects all of us, sin affects all of us, we're all sexually broken in some way. Okay? Doesn't mean that you've had a crazy addiction or you've struggled with this in deeper ways than some others. We're all sexually broken. We're all sexually. We all wrestle with sin. We all wrestle with shame. And these are all disordered desires now because of that. So unless we're really honest about this, we oftentimes just tend to suppress it, and we just tend to pretend that this doesn't really exist or that it's not a bigger deal than at times it really is. Okay, but what we're going to learn is how to redeem these desires and what the good of it is. Okay, so there's 3 different diets of sexual formation, or we call it the 3 diets of desire. One of the things that we need to reframe and understand when it comes to being a Christian is sometimes we think that having desires is a bad thing. For example, maybe you've had this desire. I want to have sex. Whether if you're single, maybe there's a longing to have that with a future spouse. If you're married, I want to have sex with my wife, or whatever kind of desire, right? You want something, right? Many times what happens is in the church and Christianity, we think that, hey, that's not a good thing, right? We tend to think that desiring things is not good. So we tell people, hey, that's not good. You shouldn't want something like that, right? Or that's not as big a desire as your ultimate connection with God, or whatever. But we want to understand that desire is God-given. Okay? So anytime we want something, anytime we desire something, it points to something deeper, yes. But that desire in and of itself is not bad. Okay? It's what you do with it. It's what you do with it that matters. Okay? So we call this 3 diets of desire, and it kind of breaks down like this. The first one is called the starvation diet. This is called repressing desires or viewing them as obstacles to spirituality. This is pretty common in the church. You may have heard something along the lines of desire is bad, sexuality is dangerous, don't talk about it, right? Don't think about it. But what happens is when we have a starvation diet mentality, what we notice is that the desires, they don't go away. They don't go away. And eventually, sometimes these buried desires, they come out in unhealthy ways. Even throughout early church history, I don't know if you guys knew this, early church leaders too, some of them in this area of sexuality and sexual desires, right, they went to very big extremes, right, to like castrating themselves, to just all these other forms of like bodily things, so that thinking that if I just get rid of this desire, then I'll be more connected to God. Right? So people have done some crazy things, okay, to kind of suppress these sexual desires. But that doesn't really make it go away, right? And in fact, I believe there was a early church leader who actually did that, right? Castrated himself, thinking that, okay, now I won't struggle with this desire anymore, realizing that even after the fact, he still had the desire. He still wanted to have, he still wanted to, right? The other ways that we've seen negative effects of the starvation diet is what we call purity culture. Purity culture. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but that is a classic example of the starvation diet, right? And what was the purity culture? Basically, it was a movement not too long ago that referred to teachings about sexual abstinence before marriage, right? And there's a lot of good that can come out of something like that, but as we also learned, there's a lot of harmful things that came out of that purity culture, right? It was stressing abstinence before marriage, right? There were stricter gender roles, women to wear more modest clothing, right? Teachings that were heavily targeting young girls to not use their bodies to accentuate any parts of their body to stumble men. Right? There were things like that. But what happened as a result of all of these things? Well, when you start teaching women that their bodies are a temptation for men, right, then it's placing the burden of a man's purity on her rather than on the man. And this would create then an environment of anxiety and even for women, like suspicion about their own bodies and how to express that. And it also led to severe sexual shame and anxiety. Messages that characterize sex as dangerous or dirty, right, make it difficult for individuals to express or embrace sexual intimacy later in life as well, even within marriage, right? This is a script that I think happens a lot in Asian American, Korean American culture too, is who talks about sex, right? I even think about, my own upbringing or parents, right? I think the closest talk that I have ever had with my parents about sex is something my mom would just say, just as a blanket statement. But anytime she would drop me off at a social thing or I would hang out with somebody, or even like when I was with like girlfriends from the past, back then, it's the only thing she would say. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. What does that mean? But that's probably the extent of it, right? Just don't do anything bad, including something that's bad within the realm of sex. That's my understanding of that, right? But just think about it. Has anyone ever told you had the talk about sex, even for yourself growing up? A lot of times we have this understanding that sex is bad, and you shouldn't. It's dirty. It's not good. A lot of those scripts can affect our understanding of sex. All right. And obviously, there's some of the things that came out of the purity movement and culture as well is there's a lot of vulnerability to abuse, right? And you hear more of that coming out in the church as well. But if you keep promoting abstinence and promoting silence and all of that, purity culture made it very easy for predators, right, to come out within the church and for people to get away with sexual abuse as well. Victims may feel a need to stay silent, right, fearing judgment for being dirty or defiled. And so this led to a lot of abuse as well, which is pretty sad. So basically, what I'm saying here about the starvation diet is if you think about sex as something that's bad and that you should just starve and not address these desires, it's not a very healthy outlet. It's not a very healthy outlet. But in the church, that's usually how it gets talked about is it's bad, or don't have these desires, or don't think about these desires. But there's a better way. There's a better way as we're going to learn. The other one is the opposite, the complete extreme of the starvation diet, and it's what we call the fast food diet. The fast food diet is you reduce sexuality to mere appetite, a casual, fleeting consumption. If the starvation diet is all about repressing sexual desires, then the fast food diet is all about just taking it all as you can, right? This is more the approach of if it feels good, then just do it. If you want it, go for it, right? It reduces desire to this appetite, And just like fast food, it fills you up for a moment, but it doesn't leave you feeling really great afterwards, right? So that's why things like pornography, hooking up with someone, swiping, on, dating apps and all that, it promises intimacy, but it doesn't deliver. It leaves us feeling emptier than before. I'm going to read an excerpt from this book from Rich Viodas. He writes this: "The fast food diet places humanity at the center of sexual desire. There is no discernment regarding our bodies. Our souls are split from our bodies in a similar but different way from the starvation diet. In the starvation diet, the soul is exalted to the point of denying the body." Okay? The soul is exalted to the point of denying the body, and the soul-numbing pain we've experienced. The danger of this diet, of the fast food diet, is that it's a cheap imitation. It's a cheap imitation of a banquet and of something more satisfying. You might feel satisfaction in the moment, but it leaves you feeling more sick. The other danger of the fast food diet is many people can have unrealistic expectations to the fulfillment of sexual desire. Right? When love and intimacy are replaced with lesser, cheaper thrills of sexual pleasure that is devoid of God, we end up in this vicious cycle of wanting something and trying to obtain it in unhealthy ways. Right? That means what? Other people then, right, become objects for our self-gratification. Right? That's pornography, right? That's masturbation. That's any form of sexual outlet, right, other than within marriage. And what happens is people end up losing touch with their humanity. Right? What I've learned and experienced with the fast food diet is sometimes when I meet with people who struggle with sex or sexual sin, sexual addiction, sometimes they'll describe it only in on terms of an appetite. Right? They'll just say like, I just wanted it. Right? I just needed an outlet. I just needed a physical outlet. It was a bodily impulse. When I hear that, part of me says yes and also no. Because on one hand, yes, you can have these desires, right? But they're internally motivated, right? And so usually the longing is for something more than just the outlet itself, okay? And so what happens in the fast food diet is that we reduce sexual desire as just a physical act, right? Hooking up with someone, watching porn, or whatever other outlets that we try to do sexually, thinking that, yeah, it was just an urge, it was just an itch. It wasn't. There's something much deeper that you're longing for, but that you've reduced it to just a physical act. But it's something much more. So, with the starvation diet, right, we elevate the soul, right, spiritual things as the highest thing, and then we take sex as the lesser thing. But the fast food diet is, people who say, I do away with God, but these impulses, these desires are heightened. These are more important than anything else. Okay? So you see the imbalance in both. What's the third option that we believe is the healthiest option? The only option really is the banquet. The gospel invites us to savor sexuality as holistic, relational, and God-giving life. The gospel changes these desires. Okay, rather than starving a desire, rather than feasting on fast food and cheap thrills and all of that, the gospel offers us a feast. What's amazing about this, guys, if you think about it, is that God doesn't erase our desires, especially sexual desires. He reorders them. Okay? He shows us that our deepest longings are not meant to be starved and not meant to be stuffed with junk, but to be satisfied in Him. Okay? This is what we were made for: communion with God and intimacy with others in a healthy way. This banquet is a beautiful picture because it's this recognition of something that is extravagant, right? It's overflowing. It's a lot, It's beautiful, it's enjoyable. Even the contents of a banqueting table and a feast are usually like something healthy and good, right? But this is the idea that we're working with here, right? Is that we want to believe that our bodies and sexuality were meant to point to something outside of ourselves, right? And in Jesus, this banquet is embodied as well as offered, that Jesus is the fullness of humanity and divinity. He shows us what God is like and what humanity is invited into. He is the model that we're called to emulate, right? And that ultimately, right, a banqueting table is something that is fully satisfying. Fully satisfying, right? It fills us in ways that these other things cannot. If you think about Jesus just real quickly, many times we never really think about it this way, but that Jesus was a sexual being. Right? Kind of hard to wrap your mind around that. That Jesus was a sexual being. And he was the perfect embodiment of taking sexual desires, not diminishing them and starving them, but not disordering or choosing other unhealthy options. But that Jesus was the best embodiment of how to live as a sexual being. Now, what I mean by that is it doesn't mean that he acted upon sexual desires or that he had sex and things like that during his life on this earth, but that he's the fullest expression of sexuality. And we're going to talk about what that looks like in a little bit. Okay. So what I mean by Jesus being sexual is that he wasn't sexually active, right? It doesn't mean that Jesus lusted, right? Because he was sinless, he was perfect. But what he did do in his sexuality is he fully participated in the human experience. Okay. We tend to believe that being a sexual person is having intercourse with another person. But that's not what it is. Yeah. Jesus lives the full human experience, right? Connecting with others intimately, showing compassion, being sacrificial, and that all comes out and stems from sexuality as well. And he offers himself, right, as a gift. So, just a few things to think about here, right? Jesus offers us a banquet of wholeness. So these are some things that I'm borrowing from Viodas here, is we have a new humanity in Christ, right? Viodas notes that in Jesus, a new humanity is offered. One not shackled by the prison of sin and shame, but liberated into the fullness of God's love. What Jesus offers us in this banquet, right, is he undoes, right, Genesis 3, right? Jesus unmasked shame by what? Right? Taking shame upon himself, dying a shameful death himself on behalf of our sin, hanging naked on a tree, right? And now that that's happened, sexual longing can be reordered and redeemed, not erased. And lastly, right, the remaking of desires. The love of God doesn't remove our desires, it reorders them. And that spiritual formation doesn't deny our embodied desires, it locates them in the proper place, inviting God to redirect them towards flourishing. So, just to sum up these last few minutes about desire is good and it's God-given, okay? How and what you choose to do with those desires is whether it becomes sinful or not, whether it honors God or not. Okay? But I don't want us to reduce desire as something that's bad and to be avoided. Okay? One of the helpful things about sexuality, and for people who struggle with sexual sin and lust and temptations and things like that, is if you're able to, take a moment to just ask, what is it that I'm really looking for? Right? Sometimes in recovery, people ask this question, what was porn? What was masturbation? What was hooking up with someone? What was it offering me? What was it offering me? What is it that I really am looking for at this moment? Many people lack self-awareness, and that's one of the things that needs to get built up in a person to understand, right? But if you're really honest with yourself, I hope you can see that you're wanting something deeper than what you settled for and what you chose. Okay? Any questions at this point before we get into some of the practices? Is it okay? All right. I wanted to just share some practical applications. I'll try to move as quickly as possible through these. But one of the ways that we want to help the men here at our church is, how do you express, right? How do you live, how do you embody sexual desires in a healthy way without, doing it in a sinful way? Okay, so that's something that we want to talk about. And a lot of these practices that I appreciated from his book is that he really focuses on the embodiment of it, the embodied practices that often kind of get neglected, because most of the time what you hear in church is read the Bible and pray, and it's all about the vertical connection, right? But for people who have sexual struggles, this is something's missing here horizontally. And a lot of times we don't give people a framework for how to deal relationally with people. Because ultimately, a lot of the root of those struggles is an intimacy problem within people, within relationships with people. And so I think this is going to hopefully help kind of give us a kickstart about how to express, our sexuality, sexual desires in a healthy way. Okay? This is regardless of what season of life you're in, how old you are, how young you are, but it applies to all of us. And we can become sort of the agents of change in this realm, in this area. Okay, so without further ado, practices that lead to sexual wholeness. Okay, the first one I think is really important is the practice of naming distorted messages, or what we call shame scripts. Oftentimes what stands in the way of sexual wholeness are sexual scripts that you've inherited from family, things that you've learned growing up in our culture as well. Here are some scripts that are prevalent in our culture and in our lives. That some people believe that there are some bodies that are worthy of love and others that aren't, based on how you look, right? Some people have a script that says any impulse or desire for sexuality that I have must be satisfied, right? Must be satisfied. Sex and sexual performance define me. Some people have a script that says sex is only a physical act. And it's not a means of loving communication, right? So there's a lot of different scripts that we have throughout our culture. Maybe you have your own from growing up and what you've heard, what you've watched, what you've learned, right? You might believe that you'll only be loved if you have somebody, right? But the gospel says you're worthy of love as you are. Maybe some of us, we've built an identity on this need to sexually be active and, sleep with as many women as possible as a way to show that this is me. But the gospel says that our true identity is surrendered to God's grace. Maybe some of us live with bodily shame, right? We're ashamed of our bodies. We're ashamed of our sexuality. But the gospel reminds us that Jesus, right, has the power to heal the shame that we carry. So there's a lot of different harmful messages about sexuality that we could have inherited through early life, upbringing, things that we've heard, right? But one of the things that helps, right, break the bondage to this sin specifically is giving a voice to it, is naming it, being able to share it. For the past few years, we don't really announce this publicly, but I've walked with a few brothers and we have a sexual integrity group. And I always felt the need that people need a space where they can share about these things, right? Without feelings of judgment, without feelings of, being able to share and open about the struggle and giving a voice to it. Because for a lot of times, in counseling, in therapy, one of the things that really helps someone heal is a phrase that someone says is to break the silence as the first step towards healing. So anything that you can't name or give voice to or share about has a hold on your life, But what's so interesting is as soon as it comes out, and this is even for people that go through severe traumatic experiences, deep pain, whatever, As soon as you give a name to it, you give a voice to it, right, begins this process of healing. Right? And I've seen that for myself, but I've seen that just through other brothers as well. But that's the first step, right, is to notice that you carry perhaps a distorted message about sin and sex and shame, and but start to give voice to it. For this, I give an example from Harry Potter. How many of you guys have ever watched Harry Potter? I read all the books. I was a big fan growing up. The movies too, yeah, I think they were pretty entertaining as well. But if you guys have ever read or watched Harry Potter, you would know that there is a big villain, right, in Harry Potter. And he's the arch enemy of Harry. And many times when people, right, refer to him, how is he referred to? How is the villain of Harry Potter? What's his kind of name?
He who should not be named.
Yes, yeah. He who must not be named, right? He who must not be named, right? That's usually how, because he's so evil and he's so dark that people get scared when they, say his name, right? Right. But his real name is, you guys know? Voldemort, right? Voldemort. That's the villain's name. Now, this is what I thought was interesting about this movie, is that, interestingly, there are only 2 wizards in Harry Potter that call he who must not be named by his real name, right? One of them is Harry, and the other is Dumbledore. You know what's fascinating about that is, interestingly, the wizards that actually, Harry specifically, that calls evil for what it is the one who's victorious over him. Isn't that interesting? Giving a name and a face to that face, to the villain, confronting it, he ends up beating him. A lot of times, though, when it comes to sexuality and sexual sin and brokenness, we're kind of like, it must not be named. It must not be named. If you really want to overcome and fight against sin struggles, especially sexual sin, because there's a lot of shame attached to it, you got to give a name to it. You got to give a voice to it. Because as long as it keeps staying inside of you and you don't break the silence, it has a hold on you. It has a hold on you. Okay. Next, the practice of sobriety. Sobriety isn't mere abstinence. It's radical honesty and transparency about sexual struggles. Acknowledging our vulnerabilities in community allows grace to move in. It's really interesting. In seminary, I took a class on sexual addiction. Okay, and one of the assignments for that class is we had to attend an AA group or a Sexual Addicts Anonymous group and all that as part of a requirement for this class. So I actually attended a few of these meetings, right, because that's part of the assignment. So I attended an AA meeting. I think it was only AA. I don't think I was able to, in my schedule, attend a Sexual Addicts Anonymous group. What I think was so interesting, and the only thing I really remember from that group, is the level of sharing that people have in sobriety groups was insane. The level of honesty, the level of struggle. Some people would share things like, man, I just really wanted to have a drink this week. I had a fight with my wife. This was happening in my life. They're so self-aware of their struggle of this sin, and the way that they share is insane. I was just blown away, and I was thinking about that, and what actually kind of inspired me from attending those meetings is, why isn't the church like that? Why can't people share like honestly and vulnerably about their struggles? Somehow the church becomes a mask for how well we're doing, rather than sharing how hard it is. I learned so much from that group. It was crazy. And I was just participating and just listening. But man, so what I mean by sobriety is I don't just mean abstinence, but what I mean by sobriety is the opportunity to share in deep and vulnerable ways. Right? We're not talking about willpower or white knuckling and things like that. referring to honesty, radical honesty. It's been said that we're only as sick as our secrets. And so if this is the case, many people, especially even in the church, are often filled with illness and disease, right? There's a psalm that says this in Psalm 32:3 that David writes, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long." Sobriety is not just for people with drug or sex problems. It's for all of us. It's for all of us. All of us need to learn how to be truthful and transparent more and more in and through our lives. Now, this is a hard practice. This is a hard practice. Why? Because it asks us to lay down, right, our pride, right, to lay down our false selves of strength and how strong we are, and what we project into the world and to people. It invites us to live with a poverty of spirit, right? And Jesus says as much, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." What does that mean? How do you know you've seen someone who lives poor in spirit? It's a person who lives like they have nothing to prove, nothing to possess, and nothing to protect. But a person who's completely free from all of that. That's a true poverty in spirit. Someone who has nothing to prove, nothing to possess, nothing to protect, but they're just an open book. It calls us to live free from the judgments and opinions of people. And if you're a people pleaser or you crave the approval of man, this is what makes sobriety hard. This is what makes being transparent and honest hard. But some of the freest people are people who have nothing to hide, nothing to protect, nothing to possess, but they're just as they are because they know who Christ is. Okay, let's keep going here. One thing that I want to highlight here, this is just a sub-point in the practice of sobriety, is one thing that's really helped me too is to understand, and if whether or not you guys struggle with sexual sin, and even if it's in the realm of addiction or not, I want this to be a good learning tool so you can help other people too who are going through sexual sin and addiction as well. Is you need to reframe the idea and understanding of addiction. Okay? You need to understand and reframe the idea of addiction. Okay. One thing that's helped here in this is that sometimes we find it hard to speak honestly about addictions, right? Because we've fixated ourselves on the act and not on the pain the addiction is seeking to soothe. Now, this is what's interesting is when you see an addict, when you see someone who's deeply entrenched in something, sex, drugs, alcohol, money, gambling, I don't know, whatever the addiction is, that is never just the problem. Okay, I hope you guys know that. So when you see someone who's struggling with like alcohol, oh yeah, they just gotta stop drinking. You know, that's their issue. You know, it's never just that. Every addict, every struggle someone has, right, is always a way to numb a deeper pain. There's always something underneath that. It's never just the act in and of itself. Just want you guys to remember that. And so what's helped me understand and have more compassion rather than judgment towards people who have addictions is that an addiction, right, is an attempt to relieve ourselves from the unbearable pain that we feel in a moment. Okay? It's a way, I'll say that again, it's an attempt to relieve ourselves from the unbearable pain of the moment. Someone feels so much pain about something that causes them to act out in that way. Now, many times an addict isn't aware of what that pain is because they've learned unhealthy coping mechanisms. But I want you guys to understand that there is always something there. Right? They've just chosen to medicate in that way, in an unhealthy way. Okay? I remember reading about this conversation. And so when you talk to an addict or someone who's struggling deeply in an area of sin, right? Saying things like this, guys, doesn't help. Just stop. That doesn't help. That doesn't help an addict. Even in church, repent of your sin. Yes, there's truth to that, but that also doesn't help many addicts as well. But instead, what does help? What does help? Many people think that reframing addiction in a healthy way is that it's a way that people have figured out to try to stay alive. And so a better way to say and talk to someone who deals with this is, you have figured out a way to stay alive. You've learned how to soothe your pain, but this way doesn't go deep enough. Let's try something else. Addiction is someone's attempt, right, to try to stay alive, to fight for life. But the way that they're doing it is leading them to death. Right? But that's how people cope. That's how people deal with struggles. Right? It's a fight to survive, but it's not the best answer. Okay, next, the practice of social bonding. Now, this is in the realm of sexual desires and sexual sin and things like that. Often what we crave in like genital intimacy, right, is what we really want is connection. What we really want is connection. Okay? One of the things that helps people heal from this area of sexual sin is to have really healthy, vibrant relationships. I don't mean like sexual love with like a spouse or a partner, but like platonic love, friendships. Someone who emotionally knows you as well. As guys, as men, that's pretty hard to do. It's pretty hard to do, right? But I will say this, for someone who really struggles with sexual sin, I'm almost positive that they don't have healthy friendships. 99.9% of the time. Every time I talk to someone who's entrenched in sexual sin, they don't have friends. They don't have people who really know them, and they're not really known by others. 99.9% of the time. So one of the ways to break that is to start having healthy friendships and opportunities to make ourselves known. Many people think that they need to rush into the act of genital sex and sexual pursuits as a way to feel like they belong and to feel connected to somebody. But what people really need is that other description of social sexuality, this opportunity to make ourselves known, to have deep friendships, and to be able to share vulnerably. Think about Jesus and back to Jesus. As being fully God and fully human, he understood the need for social bonding. Jesus experienced intimacy, connection, and vulnerability throughout his life. He gathered around his disciples. He feasted at parties. He received love. He confessed his weaknesses. He revealed intimate details about himself. He gave and received tender touch. No one can say anything about Jesus lacking humanity. Even if he didn't experience genital sexuality, he is the fullest expression of sexuality. Right? And so social bonding is this practice of living connected to others in life-giving relationships. Right? As we know, in our culture, the dangers of loneliness still keep skyrocketing. Right? How is it that you can be surrounded by a bunch of people and still feel alone? Right? The answer is simple. Loneliness is not combated by physical proximity, but by emotional closeness. That means this too, guys, right? When it comes to the practice of social bonding, we're all physically gathered in this space. We can still feel lonely in this room. And the reason why is because, does this person know what I'm struggling with? Does this person know how my week's been? Does this person know that I had a fight with my wife? Does this person know that I'm struggling spiritually? Right? That's so important, right? And so just because we gather in this way, you can easily just fill up a spot or a seat in this room and still feel alone. Right? Because what we really need is to be truly known. Okay? All right, I'm going to keep, oh shoot, time is going by so fast. All right, I'm going to move on. There's other things I was going to share, but I'm going to. The practice of healthy touch, all right? Touch also is really important when it comes to having sexual wholeness. Right? It must be exercised with care, respect, and awareness. Okay? When a baby is born, one of the first things that doctors do is they put the infant on a naked chest. okay? Usually for the mom, okay? And the practice of skin-to-skin contact shows that this is how an infant self-regulates and ensures that they are safe. Okay? There's countless stories of damaging touch and misuse of touch, especially within males, throughout history, throughout the church, in our culture today. But what we need to know is that there is a practice of healthy touch, right? Jesus, right, would regularly touch those who were sick, would touch those who were hurting, right? The practice of touch is really, really important. One of the practical ways you can do that is when you pray for somebody, right? And if they're okay with it, you can ask if you can put a hand on this person. And somehow praying for someone in that way feels so different than just praying, out loud for somebody. And so the practice of healthy touch. A few weeks ago, just really quick, our second daughter, Eliza, she had a seizure. And it was probably one of the scariest moments that I've ever gone through as a parent, just witnessing all of that. A few days later, though, I was at food bank and I was ready to share the word. And I really appreciated this, real quick. Steve just came up to me, Elder Steve, and he just looked at me and he's like, I just want to give you a hug. I just want to give you a hug. He just hugged me. And I didn't even know I needed that, to be honest, right? I didn't even know I needed that, right? But something even like that, right, was so healing and redemptive for me, because sometimes I can't give voice to the pain. I can't give voice to some of the things that, you go throughout life. But someone who comes near and says, hey, I'm here for you. It's really healing. It was really healing. He doesn't even know, he's not even here. But I just really appreciated that, right? But we need to exercise healthy touch. Now, sometimes we think, when we touch each other, guys can be a little weird about that, okay? You can kind of like caress and don't be all weird about it, okay? But we need to learn how to exercise healthy touch, a hand on someone's shoulder, right? Man hug, I don't know. Just something that shows the way of physically showing someone that you're near and you're present is really healing. And that's a great way to express sexual desire in a healthy way, Okay. Okay. The last one is the practice of making love. This speaks more to guys who are married and in a covenant relationship. But there was a pastor who shared, he was talking to a pastor who had been married for more than 50 years. Okay, and he just voluntarily shared with this author. He said, we've been married 50 years, and we are having the best sex of our lives. 50 years into marriage. 50 years. And the pastor was like, Rich Velas was like, oh, really? And what he said is, without going into too much detail, he says, it takes a lifetime to learn how to make love. It takes a lifetime to learn how to make love. Many people fall for the myth that genital sexuality should be effortless, should be easy and flawless, and just a piece of cake. But it's really hard. It's really hard. It's really hard. Lovemaking, why? Isn't just a physical act, right? But it's built in with communication, vulnerability, and spiritual union. Okay, and so that means for you guys who are married, right? I don't know, I don't want to talk about your sex life. You don't have to share any of that. Just think about how intimate and how is the lovemaking in your marriage going for you right now, right? Lovemaking often begins outside of the bedroom. So if you're like, man, I don't have much physical sex with my wife, how do I get that to get better? Make love to her outside of the bedroom, right? Serve your wife, sacrifice for her, communicate with her, open your heart to her, right? Demonstrate passion, curiosity, playfulness, respect your wife, encourage your wife, right? Affirm her, right? These are all things that we think don't matter when it comes to having physical sex, but they matter like crazy, right? Viodos writes this: intercourse is the climax of the often ordinary, sensual, clumsy, romantic ascent we take outside the bedroom. Lovemaking primarily is communication, not an activity. And that many people say that sex is something you say, not something you do. And so all of these things, I'm just going to stop here, right? But these are some practical steps about how to live with sexual wholeness in this world, okay? So I have our brothers from my discipleship group who are going to share some of their testimony and encouragement about their journey for sexual integrity.